A very warm welcome to this International Women's Day event and to Kellogg College Centre for Creative Writing. It is a real pleasure to see you all here this evening. And I'm just pausing while a couple of people come in. Wonderful, a great audience. My excellent colleague Judith Holder has organised and fronted up on International Women's Day celebrations for a number of years, and unfortunately she can't be with us this evening, but she has sent a message and so is with us in spirit. And Judith says, at Kellogg College we have been marking International Women's Day for 9 years with events that have celebrated and showcased women in all kinds of roles in society, as leaders in business, peers of the realm, entertainment and women's football, to name a few. We've highlighted some of the many struggles that women continue to deal with in public and private life. Well, carrying on in the tradition that Judith has established, this evening we're again delighted to celebrate International Women's Day and very pleased indeed to welcome the excellent and prolific writer and historian Julie Summers. Her topic this evening is, as we know, Unbuttoning Vogue, writing about the most glamorous of all fashion magazines. And Julie has written 14 works of non-fiction. I looked them all up and I felt extremely, even more impressed than I had been before I looked them up. Her most recent British Vogue that we're hearing about tonight was published by Weidenfeld to critical acclaim. And Julie's best-selling book, Jambusters, inspired the ITV drama series Home Fires, which ran for 2 seasons and had a regular audience of over 6 million. Dressed for War, which came out in 2020, is the biography of the wartime editor of British Vogue, Audrey Withers, and is in development as a drama series. We're looking forward to that. From October 2024, Julie has been a writer in residence here at Kellogg College and is working on her next book, which focuses on the women of D-Day. And she tells me this evening has been inspired by being here at Kellogg College. Now, I just wanted to share a couple of reviews of Julie's work. Of Stranger in the House, which came out in 2009, women's stories of men returning from the Second World War, Michael Swain said, one of Julie Summers' strengths as a biographer is her capacity to allow her subjects to speak for themselves. But at the same time, throughout this fine book, the reader always has a reassuring sense of the author's guiding hand. While The Spectator said, Summers has deftly woven these varied stories into a cohesive whole, while letting the characters speak for themselves. It is a fine achievement. And of the new book, British Vogue, Marion Hume, who is former editor of Vogue Australia, said, a gem. Julie's book is a delicious reveal on how gently revolutionary a glossy magazine has been. It takes us right up to the modern age and the brilliance of Edward Enninful's editorship when the world was locked down for COVID-19. Every page has some rich fact I didn't know before. And the Sunday Independent said, the fashion book of the year has to be British Vogue, the biography of an icon by Julie Summers, which details the story of the legendary century-old magazine. It's exquisitely illustrated with work from the world's top photographers, and the pages are alive with anecdotes and gossip. A history of 20th century fashion, culture, and civilization in one glorious book. So, everyone, please, a very warm welcome for Julie Summers this evening.
Thank you, Claire, very much. It's absolutely lovely to be here. I adored my year at Kellogg working as the Royal Literary Fund Fellow, and it's a real honour and a pleasure to be back and talking to you about the book that I was working on while I was here. In fact, the front cover appeared in its glorious form about 3 weeks after I started at Kellogg, so it was on my walls in my room all the time I was here. I've just put up this quote by Virginia Woolf because the greatest of all, I think probably. She illustrates in this short piece one of the problems that I as a woman have when I tell people I'm writing about fashion. Because I'm not a fashion historian. That is not my role. I'm a general historian. Second World War is my specialty, but I also write about the First World War. I've written about men coming home from the war. I've written about the bridge on the River Kwai. And I've always been interested in looking as to how women coped with the difficulties that they faced, particularly during wartime, but also in general. And I was just thinking as I was pedaling over here today, it's very easy to be flippant about fashion, but actually every time we get up in the morning or we go out in the evening, we make a decision about what we're going to wear. And it might have cropped up in some of your memories or some of your vision that it was Brian in the Oval Office who asked Zelensky why he wasn't wearing a suit. So it does matter. Clothes do matter. And if any of you saw the photographs of Melania Trump brilliantly power dressed at the inauguration, again, clothes speak volumes. So when I was first invited to write a book called Fashion on the Ration, which was going to look at wartime clothing, I said to my agent in a slightly pompous manner, I don't do fashion. She said, actually, you do. I ended up by writing a book about how the government had control over clothing during the Second World War, to the point where it dictated the width of the gusset in women's knickers. It was so strict, the utility and austerity measures and all the clothes rationing, that the government had complete control over what women wore. And over the course of writing that book, I came across this extraordinary woman, Audrey Withers, who was the wartime editor of Vogue magazine. And here she is, photographed by Norman Parkinson in 1944. A blue stocking. She was Somervillian. She read PPE, 1924 to 1927. She worked in a bookshop. She was a journalist. And when she first went to work for Vogue in 1931, she was the lowest of the low. She was a sub-editor. But she gradually made her way up through the magazine. And really almost by accident, she became editor in September 1940. And the accident was that the incumbent editor, Betty Penrose, who was an American, went back to America in March 1940 and got stranded there because Condé Nast had no intention of letting his precious editor brave the U-boats of the North Atlantic. So Audrey became editor, and she was working with the remarkable Harry Yoxall, who is photographed on the right-hand side of the screen, and he's sitting in his office, and it's just immediately after the Vogue offices had been bombed, and he asked for this photograph to be taken so that he could show his American colleagues how Vogue was continuing in the Second World War. This photograph by Steichen of a hand in a glove and the mailed fist is another photograph that Audrey Withers produced quite early on in the war. And it was her determination to convey to her readership that Vogue was more than just a fashion magazine. It was going to advise its women. It was going to give them all the tools they needed to cope with whatever the war threw at them. And in November 1940, Vogue's offices were bombed, and on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the page in Vogue that shows little snapshots of the offices with glass scattered all over them. They were on the top floor of number 1 New Bond Street, and when the offices were hit by explosives, they ended up with mud from the ground all over the floors and all over the tables, which is just quite extraordinary. And this photograph was reproduced in Vogue in December, and there it is. Here it is, in spite of it all. Vogue carries on. When I was researching Dressed for War, I had a really big problem because Vogue, under Audrey Withers, destroyed its archive in 1942 for the war effort. As a historian, that almost broke my heart. Can you imagine this incredible archive of photographs by Cecil Beaton, Edward Steichen, beautiful drawings of designs by Patou, Chanel, all these fantastic illustrations that were in the early Vogues, and they all disappeared. And it was heartbreaking. And when I eventually got into the archive at Vogue, the librarian said to me, I'm terribly sorry, Julie, but we have absolutely nothing pre-1942. And that became a huge problem when I came to write the new book. But very fortunately for me, Audrey Withers was a prolific memo writer. And there was a system between the New York office and the London office where memoranda were exchanged on a pretty well daily basis. And they were parcelled up twice a week and sent out by ferry bomber out to New York. And when I was in New York in 2018, researching the book for about Audrey Withers, I said to the archivist in Condé Nast's buildings, I said, have you got any of the memos from the 1940s? And she said, no. She said, like Britain, we destroyed everything. And I said, well, do you think you could just check? So she went off into this incredible freezer archive in the building in Broadway. And she came out with a box. And she said to me, this is material that has never been sorted. All the other material from the Condé Nast papers was sorted out, but this hasn't. Let's have a look at it. And she opened up the box, and I let out a very unprofessional, extremely loud scream. And I went, oh my God, you found the memos. And she had found 900 memos from Audrey Withers in London to Edna Woolman Chase, the editor-in-chief in New York, between 1940 and 1947. And this was the most incredible find for me, because suddenly I had the story of Audrey Withers' war. And one of the most important stories I discovered was that it was Audrey Withers who commissioned the great photographer Cecil Beaton to take this photograph. It's probably one of the best-known fashion photographs from the Second World War. And the title of it is Fashion is Indestructible. And when I went through the memos, I think this is memo 632. Yes, memo 632. And it's from Audrey Withers to Edna Woolman Chase, explaining exactly why she commissioned Beaton to take this photograph of Susan Cowell, who is a BBC announcer, in a Digby Morton suit and an Arg Tharap hat with, I can't remember who the shoes are designed by, but it was the most unique moment for me, because I realised that Audrey Withers, far more than just being a journalist, actually really understood the power of her magazine. And the book came out splendidly 3 weeks before COVID broke out, so it sort of slightly disappeared into the mess that was COVID. But in the September of 2020, I got a phone call from the head of rights at Condé Nast in UK, and she said, we love Audrey, and we wondered if you'd like to write a book about British Vogue. And my immediate reaction was, yes, I'd love to. And then I thought, oh my God, how do I do this? Because there have been 1,758 issues of British Vogue and counting. And its history is enormous. Its spread is vast. There are 70 million words written in British Vogue between 1916 and 2024. And I was really quite daunted with the prospect of actually how I was going to wrangle this book and turn it into something which was readable. So it took me 3.5 years. I'm very glad I did it. It was extremely hard work. And I'm just going to give you now a little bit of the history of the magazine, and then we'll look at why I focused on certain aspects of the book so that we balance a bit of story with a bit of writing. So Vogue was born in America in 1892. The first editor was a woman who didn't like fashion, but she did like animals. So there were quite a few tigers and lions in early editions of Vogue. It was devised by a man called Arthur Turnier, who had a vision for a society magazine that would speak to the wealthiest in society and would be both informative on fashion and design and theatre and literature, with just a little bit of gossip. And what he insisted was that Vogue would never take itself too seriously and would always have a very gentle sense of humour. And that has stuck right through for the last, in American Vogue's case, nearly 130 years. Arthur Turnier died in 1907, and the magazine was bought by this man, Condé Nast, who some people don't even know was a real man. Condé Montrose Nast, who was an American publisher. He made his first fortune working on a magazine called Collier's Weekly, which he turned around from having a readership of 2,000 to having a readership of 40,000 in the space of less than 5 years. And he was vastly successful. He was married into a famous club in America called the 400s, which was the 400 wealthiest families and movers and shakers in New York, and his wife was one of them. And he wanted to buy Vogue in order to be able to feed that audience and to have those women particularly who would influence the magazine and who would give it the kudos that he felt it deserved. He had as his editor Edna Woolman Chase. I love this drawing of her. I think it sums her up perfectly. She was described as a little bird. She looked a little bit like Edith Piaf. And she had started as a stamp girl. So she literally was sticking stamps onto envelopes when she first started in 1894. But she rose up through the ranks, a bit like Audrey Withers did 30 years later. And by 1911, she was the editor of American Vogue. She was passionate about the magazine. She loved fashion. She absolutely understood exactly what Condé Nast wanted of her. The magazine was so successful that by 1912 it was being shipped over 3,000 copies a month to Hamburg and distributed throughout Germany, France and Britain. But then the First World War broke out, and suddenly Nast was unable to ship his magazine to Britain because of the U-boat infested waters, and all essential shipping, only essential shipping was allowed to come over from America, and a fashion magazine did not qualify as essential shipping. And it was his idea, helped by a man called William Wood in Britain, that he would produce Vogue in Britain. So it would have basically American content, fashion shoots and so forth, some of the American features, but it would also have a British angle. It would tell women of Britain where they could buy their clothes, both in Paris and in London. And it would also give them a lot of information about what was going on around them. And extraordinarily, this is a photograph from Ypres in 1918. Extraordinarily, it was the second most read newspaper on the Western Front after the Saturday Post, which was also an American paper. So it was absolutely fallen upon by the officers. And it came out, first edition came out in September 1916, and it was really fascinating, the first edition, because it was all about the war. All the language that the magazine used was warrior-like, but designed to educate women about their wardrobes. So it would say things like, beware of the enemy within, which was about stockings, or the danger of too many gloves, or very, very warrior-like language. And at the same time, there were long articles about Belgian refugees, about what was going on in the hospitals on the Western Front, how the hospitals in Britain were coping with the men coming back who were injured. So it was highly topical, and Vogue felt it was very important to keep women absolutely up to date with what was going on, but at the same time giving them the diversion of what was happening at home, and hopefully making a little bit lighter of life. And it was so important, the First World War, to Vogue, that thread has gone right through up until the present day. There's always a message in Vogue about what is happening in society, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But by 2 years in, by September 1918, Paris, which had ordered all frippery to stop, there was no pretty clothes, hats had to be unadorned and so forth. It was because the war was so close to Paris. In September 1918, it was announced that in Paris, the milliners were putting 2 inches on the brim of hats. And that was just a little signpost to the couturiers that the war was going to be coming to an end. So the war ended in 1918, and over the next few years, Vogue began to gain its own sense of self. The war was over. Britain was very, very badly affected, of course, by the war. It was pretty well bankrupt after the First World War, less so than after the Second World War. Its place in the world had changed, and Vogue tried to interpret this new world for its women. Going into the 1930s, Britain was fascinated by design, and I wanted to show you 2 of the most important people in Vogue's life at that time. One of them was Noel Coward, who is sitting here on the phone to his agent in his his ultra-modern flat in London. And the other character on the right is Cecil Beaton. Cecil Beaton started writing and illustrating for Vogue in 1925, and he would go on to work for Vogue until 1980. He was the second longest contributor to the magazine. He was also probably the most important British photographer who worked on Vogue at that era. Now, Beaton was vastly important for his royal connections, and there was nothing the Americans liked more than a little bit of royal glitz and glamour. And in 1937, they got a lot of royal glitz and glamour. So here is the May 1937 fashion pages from Paris, Lanvin and Molyneux, beautiful designs, ethereal creations, and lots of lavish praise for these beautiful, beautiful pictures. And then on the next spread, the Duchess of Windsor. This was an unholy scandal. It broke in 1936 when the Prince of Wales became king and then abdicated because he couldn't live without the Duchess of Windsor. And the Americans were almost hysterical with the excitement that an American woman was going to become the wife of the king, even though he was only then a duke. And they wanted... Condé Nast and Edna Woolman Chase announced that they wanted Vogue to run 6 pages of photographs and 3,000 words of copy. And it was just too much for the British. She was so unpopular, it was absolutely not going to happen. So Audrey Withers, who by this time was working as the junior editor, was given the task of illustrating 2 pages of photographs with pictures by Cecil Beaton and the caption. And it says, "Chateau background for the Duchess of Windsor, photographed by Beaton." That was it. That's all she got. And it was just a really interesting reminder of the difference between what Britain could tolerate and what the Americans really wanted. And that was a battle that was fought throughout the whole of the 20s and 30s between the American editors and the British team. America wanted complete control over what British Vogue produced. And British Vogue kicked quite hard against the pricks, but they didn't always succeed. However, come the Second World War, and here's Audrey Withers in her hat in the basement of 1 New Bond Street, putting the book to bed in a bomb cellar, the change came because suddenly America could not influence British Vogue, and British Vogue led. French Vogue had completely closed down after the fall of France, and British Vogue was in the position of being able to dictate the whole news story. And she had on her staff the brilliant Cecil Beaton, who had been disgraced in 1938 for producing a drawing which was considered anti-Semitic in American Vogue, but she got him reinstated by 1940, and he took the then very famous photograph of Elizabeth Cowell in her beautiful dress in the ruins of Temple to demonstrate to the Americans how Britain could carry on in the war. She also had untried, but soon to be proven to be brilliant, Lee Miller. And if any of you have seen the film Lee, you'll know that this was a really interesting relationship between Lee Miller, the photographer, well, model turned photographer, and Audrey Withers, who commissioned Lee to photograph for Vogue, firstly in a hospital outside Normandy, and then later she went to St Malo, where she was supposed to be describing the surrender of St Malo, but actually it turned out the Germans hadn't read the story, and they were still fighting, so she got herself right into the middle of a war. And she then went on and produced 18 months of remarkable reportage for Vogue, which, if you think about a fashion magazine, you don't expect to see very good war writing. But actually that continued right through the 20th century. And Mary Colvin was the war reporter for Vogue for 3 years under Alexandra Schulman. After the Second World War, Vogue went back to being didactic about clothes, and there's a rather fun shoot here. It's one of Audrey's last shoots by William Klein, and it's telling people how to pose. So Vogue at that stage was quite instructive, and women would look to the magazine not only for waistlines and for lengths of skirts, but how to wear their clothes. And I think this is really rather fun: good suit and bad posture. Audrey retired in 1960 at the age of 55, and she handed over to a journalist called Ailsa Garland, who came from the Daily Mirror, who only lasted, sadly, 4 years, but was remarkably successful. And then came this woman, Beatrix Miller. And Beatrix Miller was also a journalist. She'd worked on Queen magazine, and she was known as Queen Bee because she was such a talented editor. And what Beatrix Miller did that was even greater than what Audrey Withers had done was that she ran Vogue using all the talent available to her. She was absolutely like the conductor of an orchestra. She had the greatest photographers, the very best writers, the most beautiful models. Jean Shrimpton modelled for her. Twiggy came in 67. She was absolutely at the top of her game. Her great contributor to the magazine is this woman here, who some of you might recognise, is Grace Coddington. And Grace was a model from 1959 until 1964, and then had an accident, so she became the fashion editor, and she really brought Vogue up to the level of excellence that it continued to have right through the 1960s and 70s. But she also had one of my favourite characters of all time. This is Sheila Black, who was a journalist on the Financial Times, and she's talking to Edward Heath at a party. I love the cigarette and the glass of wine. And B. Miller brought her in because she wanted to be sure that women were going to be able to navigate the 60s and particularly the early 70s and to understand the changing world, because not only did the pill come in and then abortion became legal, but also there were beginning to be a lightening up of fiscal rules for women. And so Sheila Black wrote 120 columns over the space of 10 years, and she gave fantastic advice to women on how to get a bank account, how to get their tax separately calculated from their husbands, how to do investments, where to get insurance, all these wonderful ideas. She was also pretty rude about how slow the government was in adopting decimalisation. And she was just one of the great characters who Beatrix Miller really believed should be contributing to the magazine at the highest level. Now, American Vogue had tried very hard to get back in control of British Vogue and had totally failed. And Diana Vreeland, who was the editor of American Vogue in the 50s and 60s, wrote to British Vogue, and she said, from now onwards, all the covers are just going to have a forward-facing, smiling woman. That is the front cover rule, and that lasted from 1963 until 1988 on American Vogue. But Beatrix Miller was having none of that. This is a famous cover called Jelly, which was produced by Willie Christie, who also made the front cover of my book. And he was challenged to photograph racing green, which was the colour of the season. And when he was photographing Marcy Hunt in this photograph, he kept saying, it's not working. And so the art director said, get closer. He went right in onto her mouth, and he took this photograph and he said, we've got a cover. And there was a lot of upset upstairs in the manager's office, but it got through, and it's one of the most popular of all Vogue covers. And the other one is this photograph by David Bailey of Manolo Blahnik, the shoe designer, and Angelica Houston. And they'd done a shoot on a beach in Corsica, and they were just standing having a glass of champagne, and suddenly Bailey saw this glorious shot and made this photograph. So there was always a sense that British Vogue was and should remain independent. The photo shoots under Beatrix Miller were inspired, and my favourite of all was this one, which was a photographic shoot by Snowden in Paris in 1985, and it was styled by Grace Coddington, and it was a tiny little studio probably about the size of this platform I'm standing on, and the floor was covered in 2 tons of sand. They'd gone to the Bois de Boulogne to pick up leaves, and the horse was a Lipizzaner stallion, and the horse's trainer actually got at one stage the horse to rear up on its back legs, and this tiny little model, Isabelle Pascal, she was an actress, was in this incredibly dangerous studio with this horse and all the activity going on. But I think there's something Watteauesque, there's something very beautiful, very almost sort of ethereal about these lovely photographs. Beatrix Miller retired in 1986. She was succeeded by Anna Wintour, who lasted for 15 months. And she was then succeeded by Elizabeth Tilberis. And then came the woman I most admire, which is Alexandra Schulman. Alexandra Schulman was Vogue's editor for 25 years. She had an extraordinary tenure. She started in 92, and she had everything from the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, through to 9/11, the Arab Spring, 7/7, and so forth. And she navigated brilliantly the way the world changed from just fashion magazines to the Sunday magazines reporting on fashion to then social media and 24-hour news. She was very good at spotting talent and nurturing it and having the confidence to spot people who you might not necessarily think would fit in Vogue. And here is a character who I actually admire enormously. And this is Mrs. Beckham. And Victoria Beckham first appeared with her husband in 1999 when she was just pregnant with the first boy. And she has appeared on 4 more covers, quite unusual. There's nobody else who wasn't a model who's appeared on so many Vogue front covers. But the reason she was so important to Vogue is because she is a consummate professional, and Vogue could see past all the noise and all the fame and all the sort of publicity that went around the family to see that this was a very serious model. She also complained a lot, Alexandra, that she couldn't get politicians to pose for Vogue, and she got very frustrated. But in 2007, she had an absolute coup because there was a G20 summit, and look who arrived. Mrs. Obama. And she said, if it's possible to personify power, Mrs. Obama in this remarkable cardigan, it personified absolute power and authority. And Alex felt so very vindicated by using Mrs. Obama in this shoot, because she wanted people to understand that Vogue was just so much more than about fashion. So she left Vogue after 25 years in 2017, and she was followed by Edward Enninful, which Claire mentioned was somebody that Marion Hume felt was remarkable. He brought in a whole idea for diversity. He wanted to challenge what he saw as a very white culture at Vogue, but nobody could have predicted what he really excelled at, and that was during the pandemic. He suddenly was faced with this impossible situation, as Audrey Withers had been in the Second World War, how to deal with the total shutdown of Britain and produce a magazine that had a lead time of 3 months. And I think, to his enormous credit, he produced a sort of triplicate of issues. This is one from August 2020, when he asked Jamie Hawksworth, the photographer, to take his camera and to cycle round and photograph essential workers. And this is Norgis Harford, who was an overland driver, but he photographed midwives, nurses, hospital cleaners. He photographed a postie, which is a lovely photograph of this girl getting into her van, completely surrounded by all her friends, not social distancing, so they had to cut the friends out of the photograph. But what he did so cleverly is he understood how important Vogue could be at a moment of real crisis. So he had this one, which was the new front line, and then the next issue was a reset issue when he commissioned all the most famous photographers and artists who'd ever worked on Vogue to either paint or draw or photograph their favourite scenes that they were seeing at the time. And then the next issue was about Black Lives Matter. And those 3 issues are the only time Vogue has ever had what I would call a triptych of issues. So how on earth was I able to get that story into 150,000 words? I was commissioned for 130, but I went over, of course. And it was a really big challenge, actually, because not only was it 1,758 issues, but there were all these different aspects of the 20th century. And I realised that actually what I was telling was the story of the 20th century seen through the eyes of this extraordinary magazine. And I had the great privilege of having a desk in Vogue House downstairs in the bowels, where there were also buckets collecting water when it leaked and trains rumbling past. It was quite a sort of uncomfortable space, but glorious to be there. And then this is my friend John, who always used to say, "Hello, Jules," when I walked into Condé Nast. He was completely delightful. And I had to decide how I was going to make this book work. And in the end, I started a very large database, which I'll show you in a second. But mainly I wrote notes about what I was reading and highlighting the issues that I wanted to bring out of the magazine. As I said before, all the pre-1942 material had been destroyed, but the wonderful, amazing, fantastic managing director of Condé Nast Publications, Harry Yoxhall, kept diaries. Now, this man didn't just keep diaries, he bound them every year. And you can see there's a whole batch of diaries, which his wonderful his grandson let me read when I went to borrow them from his house in Suffolk. And you can see from his handwriting, it's beautifully clear. Sometimes he wrote in French, Sometimes he wrote a week, wrote up an entire week. Very often he wrote day by day. And what he gave, because he started working for Vogue in 1923, was the complete picture of Vogue from 23 up to 63 when he retired, charting the way it changed, and particularly the moment when it broke free from American Vogue. And that was a remarkable moment for me. Here are my notebooks. I love my notebooks. So they're all indexed and I'm completely obsessive about them. But I also had this huge database. And I basically, every single issue, I made a note of the date, the name, what the issue was about, whether it was about autumn fashion, whether it was about spring fashion or weddings or whatever it was, who the main photographers were, and then those articles that are in bold, those are the articles that I particularly wanted to pick out and perhaps use for quotes in the book. So the book took over 2 years to write, which is most unusual for me. I normally write my books in about 6 months, but this was just huge. And my lovely husband took a photograph he took a screenshot of the editing I did between Vogue's, the first draft and the 16th draft. And as you can see, I'm pretty hard on my own writing. The red is all deletions, the green is additions. There's almost no page that remained untouched because I just had to keep on massaging it and picking out the gems and making sure that the magazine was represented in a way that was light and readable. Because if I'd tried to regurgitate or to paraphrase 70 million words, I think I would have probably died of boredom myself and probably killed most of my readers. So it was a big discipline to write this book, probably the most difficult book I've ever had to write, but in some ways also the most enjoyable. And one of the questions we had was, how are we going to illustrate this book? Because I have 70,000 photographs on my computer from Vogue. It was so hard. Not. Just wonderful looking through these amazing pictures. But I could not find a front cover. It was so difficult to try and find a cover that wouldn't date. And eventually I saw a photograph in the 1970 edition of Vogue, 1974 edition of Vogue, and I contacted the photographer, a chap called Willie Christie, who was married briefly to Grace Coddington, and he was fantastic. Not only did he have the negatives, he also had the contact sheets from the photo shoot, which he did in December 1976. Sorry, it was 77 it came out. So 1976, a December photo shoot. And it was wonderful to see the way he'd got the model to move and the way Grace Coddington had styled it, and she'd used a wind machine. And he took just 3 sets of photographs, so just 36 pictures, which is really unusual for a photo shoot, but that's all he did because she was so good. And here came this one amazing photograph, and when I saw it in the magazine, I messaged my editor. I said, I think I found the front cover, because the clever thing about it is it's almost impossible to date this photograph. And Lizzie knows because I tried it out on her, but I said to people, what date do you think this picture is? And quite often people say 30s, 40s, 50s, 70s, maybe not very many people 70s. Sometimes people say it's 2000s. So for me, it symbolises everything that Vogue's about. It's about fun, it's about beauty, it's about mystery, but it's also slightly light-hearted, which I think was very important, and that's what the book was about. So Clare and I are going to have a conversation. I do invite you to ask as many questions as you like, but I hope I've just given you just a little bit of a feel for how I unbuttoned Vogue.
Well, I think we all would like to thank Julie very much for that engrossing account of what is indeed an icon. And I think, thank you, Julie, for looking at it from a whole range of angles. And I was really interested in the the kind of serious topical aspect as alongside, as you say, the beauty, the sort of fun of things. I wondered, if I may start off with a question, then we'll open to the audience. I wondered, how did you find a voice to hold that whole thing together?
Thank you. It was quite difficult, and in the end, what I tried to do was to take every decade. It's basically divided into decades. The book, the theme of every decade. So at the beginning, when Vogue first was born, it was very sickly child. It was, you know, making huge losses for Condé Nast, and so I allowed the magazine in a way to grow up and speak of its own health, really. That's how I thought about it. But I suppose if my narrative voice is there at all, it's just to guide one through the 20th century, which was such a fascinating thing to do. I've never covered an entire century in a book before, and it was a real challenge. When I got to the 70s, which is, I'm very old, I was born in 1960. When I got to the 70s, I thought, oh my God, I remember this. And then I got to AIDS. There are people here, I'm sure, who remember the AIDS crisis, and I found myself actually weeping with the recollection of how ghastly it was. And then this incredible roll call in 2000 of all the people who died of AIDS in the 80s. And so, in a way, it took its own, it let its own part, it followed its own path, really.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Who would like to start off with questions from the floor? A hand at the back there, the mic's coming across.
Thank you very much, it was fascinating. I wanted to ask whether you got any insight into Anna Wintour, because you were saying she was so briefly in the UK, and then she's had this enormous reign in the US, but she's British. I just wondered if you sort of have a view on why that's happened and
well, she's
her
half British, so her father
is she?
British,
Okay.
and her mother was. I mean, Anna Wintour was a really interesting character because she was brought in after Beatrix Miller's incredible reign of 22 years to make Vogue more like American Vogue, to make it more commercial, to respond really to what was going on in the 1980s, which was power dressing and big shoulders and, you know, sort of quite aggressive. And what she did with the magazine was she did two things. She brought in Michael Roberts, who had been working at the Times, and she brought him in as her designer, and instantly the magazine looks different. Her magazine is much more white space. The fashion is much faster. There's a real sense of, you know, women are too busy to worry about looking at fashion. You know, we'll make the decisions for them. We'll tell them what to wear and so forth. And she'd always wanted to run American Vogue because that was her goal. And so over the period of her 15 issues in British Vogue, she shook up quite a lot. She sacked a lot of people. She sort of rejigged the editorial team. She kicked out quite a few of the models. And I think what she did was she just took the authority of her position as a very senior editor, and she interpreted it in her own way. And I mean, she describes herself as Vogue. And I think the problem I have with that is that Vogue is far bigger than any one individual editor. You know, there's no way that Audrey Withers would have described herself as Vogue, or Beatrix Miller, or Liz Tilberis, or even Dorothy Todd, the famous 1920s editor who was fired. And I think Anna has become Vogue in a way that no other editor ever did. And that was possible at American Vogue, but it never would have been possible at British Vogue, because British Vogue's too quirky. So I think once she got to America, she could shape her reign, if you like.
Thank you. Another question?
Thank you very much again for giving your time to share with us your knowledge on Vogue. So just thinking about the title, you said that you'd taken some time to choose that cover picture. What were the earlier titles that Condé Nast might have come out with? And given that Vogue was for the American market, was it a little bit risky to choose such a I don't know, perhaps a French-sounding word etymologically?
Oh, the name Vogue.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the cleverest brand of all times, isn't it? Vogue, just extraordinary. It was designed, it was conceived by the first American editor. She came up with the idea of Vogue, and it just immediately, it just sang. It was completely perfect. And when I talked to Nicholas Coleridge, who was the editor, he was the managing director of Condé Nast Publications in the 80s and 90s, and he said to me, these are the 5 most famous letters in fashion. And yes, it has got a French sound to it. It's slightly whimsical in some ways, but actually it's also very strong. And when one of my negotiations was, could I use that on the book, and could I use the typeface, because they're very protected. Though early Vogues did not have a set typeface. It wasn't until the 60s, 50s, 60s that this typeface was set. And it was a protracted negotiation, shall we say, which resulted in me having to be very generous towards Condé Nast financially. Not at all.
Thanks very much for that. I'll come in with a question now before we take more from the floor. You mentioned, interestingly, how at its start in America, Vogue was, for the top 400, the terribly rich, as no doubt it would be. But I wonder, looking at that period from then to now, what do you think has changed fundamentally in terms of the sort of demographic of Vogue readers? I don't mean in terms of, asking you to quote figures, but how has that sense of class and Vogue's position in relation to it changed over the last century and this?
That's a fantastic question, Claire. Really brilliant. It changed very quickly when Condé Nast came in charge, because what Condé Nast realized was that, yes, he was appealing to the 400 club, but actually what he was really appealing to was women with aspiration. And so he was designing his magazine for people who could dream. They could only dream that they could wear a Vianney dress or a Chanel or something like that, a Paquin. And at the same time, as fashion became cheaper, which it did over the course of the 30s and 40s, and particularly coming into the 50s when women had more money, they were then able to aspire to be able to dress like the women in Vogue. And one of the extraordinary things that happened accidentally in the Second World War was that the government had this brilliant idea when they were designing the austerity and utility clothes to get the couturiers to design the clothes. So Norman Hartnell and, not Molyneux, but Norman Hartnell and Hardy Amis and Victor Stiebel, various others, designed utility clothes. And so women who had seen the Queen wearing a garment that would have cost £3,000 in today's money, so 30 guineas, could suddenly buy it for 3 guineas themselves, or less than 30 shillings. So the democratization of fashion had a very big impact on the readership, but it happened much earlier than one would suspect, which is interesting. And today, the readership is probably younger than it was maybe in the 70s and 80s, when you did get people from the age of 16 up to 86, 87 reading the magazine and writing in and saying, I don't like those naked writhings. I can't show this magazine to my grandfather. So, there's always been a feisty group of correspondents who've had their say on their opinions on Vogue.
Thank you so much for this. Just a quick follow-on in terms of naked writhings. How did Vogue really get to grips with, let's call it the sexual revolution, quote unquote, of the 1960s? Sort of the rise of, arguably, the apparent rise of woman power in a way that hadn't been there before. How did Vogue get to grips with that?
Well, like so many things that happened at that period, it had a dilemma. Because on the one hand, it embraced everything that was new and exciting for women. On the other hand, it was still producing photographs of women at Ascot wearing gloves. But it loved the music. It missed out on Elvis Presley, completely passed them by, but it got the Beatles with their Robin Hood haircuts, and it got the Rolling Stones. They found Mick Jagger quite scary. But what, of course, they also picked up on very quickly were the Jane Ashers and the Marianne Faithfulls, who were collateral damage, one would say today, but were very much part of the music scene, and they focused on them. So Marianne Faithfull became a very favourite Vogue model, and Jane Asher was hugely important to Vogue as well. And then quite quickly, the fashion stylists and the designers got to grips with the 60s, and in Vogue loved it, and the photographers, found it fascinating. And David Bailey, a working class photographer from London, and Terence Donovan and Ralph Duffy, they all came through and were, very much the energy of the 60s, and that is how Vogue kept its youth and its sort of its passion for sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Fantastic. Sandy, a question? Just coming.
Vogue's survival depends to a large extent on advertising. Did you find out the extent to which the advertisers, the big advertisers, influenced the content of Vogue?
Question, and it's a really interesting one. The answer is that they don't, but of course they do. I mean, the line that Vogue gives, and certainly up until the 80s, was there is no advertisers are allowed to influence the content of Vogue. They can't tell us what photographers we can use, they can't tell us what features we can use. But Alexandra Schulman was the most honest of all the editors I spoke to, and she said, there were times when I ran a piece on abortion or a piece on mental health issues, and an advertiser who had that editorial or that feature next to one of their adverts would complain to me. And then there were times when advertisers withdrew because they were annoyed about some policy that Vogue had come up with. But fundamentally, the editors and particularly the managing director tried as hard as possible to ensure that the advertising was kept completely separate from editorial content. And by and large, it worked, and by and large, it still works. Having said that, what Vogue very cleverly started to do, because it wasn't very happy sometimes with the quality of the photographs that the advertisers were producing, it started to run a thing called Vogue Promotions, where they would use a David Bailey or more recently Patrick de Marchelier or Marie Testino to photograph for Givenchy or I don't know, Prada or something. And so they would be called Vogue Promotions because the advertisers would pay for Testino or de Marchelier to take the good photographs, and Vogue would then reproduce them. And for those shoots, the Marchelier or Testino were paid proper big bucks, whereas the models, Kate Moss, anybody know what Kate Moss gets paid for doing a photo shoot in Vogue? Lizzie knows. 75 quid. That's what she gets paid. That's the day rate for the models, and the photographers get paid a bit more, but not a lot, because the idea is that Vogue is such an important calling card from them that they don't need to pay them very much. So in a way, the Vogue promotions were a good way of paying the models and photographers as much as they deserved, and charging the Pradas and the Escadas and so forth to pay for that.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Hello. You mentioned this very briefly, but given the rise of the role of social media in the world of fashion over the past 20 years, do you think that's had an impact on Vogue's success and exclusivity and its content?
That's a really good question. The impact of social media is huge, no two ways about it. And they say that if they're going to run on Thursdays, not every week, but on Thursdays, they very often run a beauty piece, and they get 3 million hits, absolutely straight off. It's quite extraordinary, the reach they have. I think it's not affected Vogue's success, but what it has affected is Vogue's courage to tackle difficult issues. So Alexandra Schulman was really happy after, for example, 7/7, to run a piece on the women, the Islamic women, and the whole great long piece, which was very controversial when it appeared. Or there was a piece she ran on female terrorists, female suicide bombers. And she said to me recently, she said, I never could have run that now. That simply wouldn't have been possible to do, because social media is so immediate and so aggressive. And the magazine has a lead time of 3 months, and very often more for an article. So what they do is they moderate their online content to respond to what's happening on a day-by-day basis, 24-hour basis, and then their features and their issues that they tackle tend to be less controversial than they were in the 60s and 70s. I mean, in the 70s, there was a really gruesome article by Liz Kendall, who was the features editor, about abortion. And they literally described one. And I just read this thing, like, oh my God, you couldn't do that now. So it has changed. For sure it's changed. And social media has had an impact on that.
One last question, or are we done? Oh, over there. Thank you.
Thank you. I loved your talk. So we talked about social media being a big change, and we know AI is a big change. So do you think your book would have been different if AI was available, like when you started the work? And what are your thoughts on AI? Just because you talked about 70,000 photographs and all the issues that you had to review, do you have a love-hate relationship now being a biographer? So I'm just curious your thoughts about AI.
It's a really good question. And I have to confess, because I'm the age I am, I have not yet engaged with AI. And I genuinely mean that. I have not tried ChatGPT. And it's partly out of a sort of fear of it. And it's partly because I'm actually slightly frightened of losing my own voice. And I felt very passionately writing this book. It had to be my thoughts, my take on everything, because I had to be able to stand up and justify it. I'm working on a new book, which is about the women of D-Day. And people keep saying to me, look, Julie, just use AI to do the research. And I'm not quite comfortable with that. I feel passionately I have to do all my own writing. It has to be my words, it has to be my phraseology. But I think AI is a remarkable tool. I mean, just extraordinary. And I think it's changing everything, isn't it? And it's changing fashion, it's changing Vogue, of course, like everything else. But I'm a sort of bit of a dinosaur, I have to confess.
Well, I completely agree with what Julie has just said, and I think that sense of, as a writer, doing one's own research and translating it through one's own thought processes into the voice that is one's own. I know that may sound horribly old-fashioned, but I believe passionately in that. And I also believe in the wrongness of writers' material being just taken and utilized into AI stuff without any recompense. Basically, we as writers are being used in ways that do need control, if control is possible. So I shall immediately descend from that particular hobby horse and thank you in the audience very, very much for your questions and for coming along. And a huge, huge thank you, Julie Summers, for a really fascinating talk, which I think took us into lots of important issues in all kinds of ways. And I think really, really something to think about taking away from your talk. And just to say that we have a seminar for the Centre of Creative Writing on the 14th of May. It's Ingrid Persaud, a prize-winning Faber novelist, and she is going to be coming to speak to us. So I hope a number of you will join us then. But for now, a big thank you, a big round of applause, please, for Julie Summers.